So then we are back with the more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation is from the original documents of the prophets of old from the time of Israel, giving us then the understanding of the time of the end and the future events. So then we can understand the spiritual realms and how they interact with each other, as we understand there is a gap that was then opened and then perceived throughout the world. And then when this spiritual layer was then separated from the regular secular layer of leadership of Gentiles trade-wise in the world, this separation, this gap, began then another type of spiritual warfare in the spiritual realms until the holy cities are in place. When it starts then the holy city, then the spiritual warfare would then finalized. However, this spiritual unrest in the spiritual realms is going to remain until the first city then is established. Regarding then the prophecy of Yeshayahu 1:8, tabernacling amongst the fears. Until then, the spiritual unrest will remain, because it's part of the prophecy. And there is no way of returning to those old junkies, because a time of transitional time. So then, understanding from the viewpoint of the Messiah and what he was saying when then he was speaking of the future and of the temple, he was then pointing out to the people there is a time of transition from the first service and the second service. But the second service would depend upon the completion of the first service. Have in mind, while the Messiah was at the top of the mountain, then he was explaining those areas of the prophecy of the future based upon Yeshayahu. He was not speaking of his own. The Messiah was always basing himself as then the foundation of the Torah. He was precisely quoting the factor of then Yeshayahu and the other prophets, and he was pointing them of the transitional time. First service, the second service. But since it was so earlier at time for the people to understand the transitional period of time, they began to cling to the old junkies. And they couldn't believe. For so many centuries, they had then the sight of the city and the holy temple. And then Shimon, the great king, the great empire, the great kingdom, how could it be destroyed? And the Messiah was not playing games. He said, this very temple that you are speaking of, not a stone is going to be upon another. And he was right. He did said properly. Not very long, a few decades later, then the temple was destroyed. So then while we are perceiving then on a secular level, try to understand, secular level, comes then the so-known Mayan calendar. Secular level, a lot of people, they do have spiritual abilities, a person might say, and they perceive certain shifts in the spirit. This is true. However, what would be helpful for them also is understanding the spiritual understandings from then the Hebrew, so it enhances further their knowledge. And this portion of it is related with the 1,000 years that ended when then Jerusalem and the tomb was destroyed. They don't read the scripture and they are doing fine, because the regular scripture is a piece of junk. However, it would be helpful for them to have some references of the original scripture so they can understand then what's coming in the future. So then the 1,000 years is spoken of in Revelation, the 20th chapter. Then the first 1,000 his people gave directives. The second 1,000 then was the kingdom of Satan, gave directives, and didn't work. So then people are experiencing a shift in a spiritual world. Even the Mayan calendar found it. But in terms of the planets and the stars and the lining up of those are not related with it. It's a simple factor of there is then religion away from trade, because there are dual layer of understanding regarding those topics. Simply is going to be absolutely 100% secular in terms of the true divine guideship from heaven. Until then, the holy cities are established, and starting with the first city, and then for those interested, they can report to the cities for further instructions. And it's not the teaching of the Torah, neither the prophets. Purely coming with their problems. The problem that we have is this. What do you say? Do this, this, this. They turn around and they resume. Simple. There is no imposing of religion, no imposing of Torah, no imposing of prophets, no imposing of any kind of religious activity. Because they have their own doings, and then they should do as they perceive the best. However, they are going to be very tuned with the new system coming from China, because they can get their earnings from extremely easy. So this is in fact the understanding of the spiritual transitional time. So there is no relation with the planets lining up and then destruction of the planet and people going underground and the whole 9 yards. That's what then the Mayans perceived when this shift from separation of the secular trade and the spiritual involvement with this trade were then separated. It's a simple spiritual shift, but doesn't relate with the earth. However, when they received those understandings, they thought it was related with the earth, but truly wasn't. So the 21st is going to come, and absolutely nothing earthwise will take place. So you can relax. Those who are in those caves can return, can go to their homes, can relax, can have a cup of tea, watch some television, some Sherlock Holmes, and then resume their duties. Because it's already set from the prophecies of Yeshayahu where the first city is going to be at, and where they're going to tabernacle around, and then the generation of the other cities. Mainly because understanding from the Hebraic words, we came to realize each Hebraic word means a specific meaning. They don't have multi-meanings. So when you have the word tabernacle, means the presence of the Creator Himself. This is what it means. That's why He tabernacled amongst us. Speaking of, if we were Hebrews. He, the Messiah, has tabernacled with us being Hebrews. But we are not Hebrews, so the Messiah came and tabernacled with them. So the understanding of the tabernacle word then placed amongst the fierce, then you begin to understand what it means. The restoration period of time, and then the creation of the city. From there, to those interested after the completion of the city, when they have doubts at their own choice, they are not forced. They show up at the gate, they give their answer, and then they turn around and they resume their services. And obviously the most important topic at the time is going to be then the computer system. Because of many nations rebuilding and many situations going on at the same time. And then at the very end, will to have then a returning on their own of the religious activities mixed with the trade. But it is much later. Much, much, much later. They shouldn't even be concerned at the time. Not for at least another 10 years. Roughly 10 years, not even until 10 years. Because there is so much rebuilding to be done, so much spiritual understanding must be recovered, so then we would be in a place where the Yohanan was at when he was the first to be in the holy city. So there is no more mysticism coming from the Hebraic holy understandings. So then the other people, whatsoever they decide to do, they should only be concerned with the trade system. Because that's where their earnings are going to be at. And then whatsoever they do otherwise, that's their own. Because at least no person is then deceived in going to caves and then trying to stock up with cans, and then because the end is coming and destruction of the earth, not for much later. So they are not deceived by church, they are not deceived by religion, they are not deceived by crazy people. Only through the original scripture we can find the answers. And the answers are given. And the rest of us rebuild. As we understand China is going to come, leading the world in the market, we should then wisely retrieve and let the China then do the patrols of the waters, because then they can enforce trade and they enforce peace because they want trade. Then the countries in the Middle East at war, they would cease from war. And then as they rebuild, then the Chinese, they give the materials required. And then as Europe is breaking, the Eurozone is breaking, people already know it. Nobody can deceive them anymore. And then China is going to start implementing their computer system. As we have already Citigroup involved with the Chinese bank in terms of investments. The system is already starting, very early in its, in quote, conception, but it is in place. And then for some time we won't have war anymore. For some time the nations are going to be rebuilding. There are going to be obviously skirmishes, but not to the point of blown wars. Because it's a time of restoration. As long as the Chinese then they have their way in enforcing peace via trade, then the rest of the world can make their earnings. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.